with me, if you would, this morning to Zechariah chapter 9. We decided to try out I'm not sure what you call it, the earpiece mic this morning. Audrey told me last week, well, you came through loud and clear when you looked down to read from the Bible, but if you look to the left, or if you look to the right, we sort of lost you. So hopefully the earpiece mic, or whatever, headset mic, that's what I'm looking for. Hopefully that will help things out this week. In Zechariah 9, we'll begin reading in verse 9. Rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. Sing aloud, O daughter Jerusalem. Lo, your king comes to you. Triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. He will cut off the chariot from Ephraim, and the war horse from Jerusalem, and the battle bow shall be cut off. He shall command peace to the nations. His dominion shall be from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. As for you also, because of the blood of my covenant with you, I will set your prisoners free from the waterless pit. Return to your stronghold, O prisoners of hope. Today I declare that I will restore to you double. Let us pray. Father, we thank you for your holy scriptures. We thank you for your prophets that you have sent to speak your word. And we thank you for your word made flesh, Jesus Christ. And I pray that as I attempt to expound this passage this morning, that you would offer me your spirit and be with me in delivery, even as you've been with me in preparation. And now and always, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen.
Amen.
Zechariah is one of a group of three prophets. He is the second to last book in the Old Testament, and these last three are what people sometimes call the post-exilic prophets. So Israel's history is full of a great many ups and downs. So of course God called Abraham to be the ancestor of his people, and then brought forth a family from a man and his wife who were too old to have children. And of course this family grows and has maybe more than its fair share of drama, until one day there is a famine in their homeland. And so they go down to Egypt to buy grain, and, well, a story for another time maybe is how they end up staying in Egypt. And the children of Israel, as you can call them by this time, grow and multiply in the land of Egypt until eventually the pharaohs become concerned that they are going to grow too numerous, too powerful, and so they force the Israelites into slavery. Then, centuries later, God finally says, I have not forgotten my people, and sends them a deliverer and saves them from slavery with a series of mighty signs. After this, the people make a covenant with God at Sinai, and he plants them in the promised land. And this is the plan that God has given for his people. He had promised Abraham so many years ago, so many generations ago, so many centuries ago, for that matter, that I am going to plant your descendants in a land of their own, and that I will make of you a great nation. So it's hard to overstate what a crisis it was for the Israelites when the great nation was conquered by a nation, a bigger nation, with a more powerful army. I've said it this way before. The Israelites were taken away from the land that God had promised them. They saw the great city of King David overthrown and laid in ruins, and the temple of God Almighty was destroyed. But empires don't last forever, and God certainly does not forget his people. And so God raised up a king of Persia named Cyrus, who defeated the Babylonian Empire, who had carried the Israelites away into captivity. And Cyrus allowed the Israelites to return home. And of course, this is at first a great moment. There is rejoicing as Israel's on their way back. We finally got a chance to go back home. Unfortunately, it doesn't last long. And see, now I hope by now you're starting to feel the ups and downs of Israel's history, because when they come back, Jerusalem is still laying in ruins. They didn't get much more than Jerusalem and kind of the immediate surrounding area. And if you remember, Jerusalem sits on top of a hill. And so if you've ever tried to grow a garden, you might have heard the expression bottom ground. You don't want to try to grow things on the hillside, because on the hillside, the rain will wash the good soil away and just leave rocks behind. So if all you have is the city on the hilltop and maybe some of the hillsides, you don't have great farmland. So it's not a time of plenty like they had hoped for when they came back. And of course, you come back and you still have yet to rebuild the temple. They're going to have to rebuild the temple themselves. And so the backdrop of the visions that Zechariah saw and the messages that he preached is this disappointed lethargy. If you read these last three prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, you might imagine them preaching to people who are in just this sort of gray doldrums as a people. They are beaten down, for one thing, because they've just been through, these last two generations have just been through this terrible exile, and they come back and didn't really get what they were hoping for. I think of the phrase, oh, it'll be fine, a lot when I start to think about Israel in the post-exilic period. Like Haggai complains, or he brings God's message that warns the people, you haven't built the temple back. You're living in paneled houses, and my house yet lies in ruins. Rebuild the temple. And I can imagine the Israelites, someone suggesting, hey, do you think we should get around to putting the temple back up? And somebody saying, sooner or later, it'll be fine. And Malachi complains to the people about offering blemished animals in sacrifice. God had forbidden offering blemished animals in sacrifice. You had to bring healthy animals, unwounded animals, and for many of the sacrifices, the firstborn was required. But once again, I can hear the conversation, someone saying, are you sure we want to offer this sheep? It's got a wounded leg. And someone coming back, oh, it'll be fine. And there's just this, like I said, this grayness about Israel as they come back to the promised land. And so it is into this context, this sort of gray, soupy, sleepy lethargy that Zechariah preaches, rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion, shout aloud, O daughter Jerusalem, lo, your king comes to you, triumphant and victorious is he, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. And of course, we may remember from our Gospels that Jesus takes up this passage and fulfills it when he rides into Jerusalem on a donkey. Jesus Christ is the promised king of Israel that these despairing, depressed Israelites were looking forward to. Now, one thing to mention about this passage is that he says, rejoice greatly, O daughter Zion. The gospel, as the Apostle Paul says in Romans, is good news to the Jew first and also to the Greek. So in what sense is the gospel good news to the Jew first? Well, first of all, Jesus, in his project of taking up and fulfilling all things, takes up and fulfills the calling of Israel. Israel was called to be a light to the nations, to show the world what God is like. In one place in Leviticus, God says, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. And so, of course, the Israelites were people like you and me. They were sinners, and they failed in this vocation. But the Lord's plan, oddly enough, was never that it would end with Israel. God sent Jesus into the story of Israel to bring this story to its completion, to accomplish what sinful Israel could not do. And so Jesus becomes the one who shows the world what God is like, who is holy as God is holy. And God also promised Israel I will be your God, and you will be my people. This is another way that Jesus fulfills the story of Israel, because in Jesus, God is walking among his people once again, just as he did in the Garden of Eden. Now the God of Israel walks on earth as an Israelite. And finally, Jesus is the culmination of Israel's hope. Jeremiah promised the people a new covenant. There is this forward look to the history of Israel. There's a sense that we have the law of Moses, and the law of Moses is good, but God is not finished yet. Jeremiah promised a new covenant that would be written not on tablets of stone, but on human hearts. And God has delivered that in Jesus. And of course, the apostles said that the gospel is good news to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. That's where we come in. You see, Jesus would not really have fulfilled Israel's calling if he had only fulfilled it for Israel. Remember, Israel is a light to the nations. Israel has a message for the whole world, or perhaps better, they have something to show the whole world. And so, Jesus takes up that vocation and becomes that light, first to Israel, to restore Israel, and second, to all the nations of the world. Christ the King's dominion is global. And here again, there is so much prophecy in the Old Testament about how all nations shall stream to the Lord's mountain, and that one day everyone would know God, just as the Israelites do. And in verse 10b, we read, "He shall command peace to the nations. His dominion shall be from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth." This is the good news for us, that we get to jump in on this project that God was working on for so long before we ever showed up. You might remember Jesus' story about a man hiring workers for his vineyard, and he hired some at 6 in the morning, said, "I'll pay you a day's wages, go work in my vineyard." And some at 9 in the morning said, "I'll pay you a day's wages, go work in my vineyard." And some he hired at the end of the day and said, "Go work in my vineyard for the rest of the day, and I'll pay you what is fair." And then, as everybody lines up to get paid, the owner of the vineyard pays each person 1 denarius, which is your standard issue, 1 denarius for 1 day's work. And maybe understandably, the people who worked all day from 6 a.m. are angry. And the vineyard owner says, "Are you jealous because I am generous?" And Jesus tells this story to the Jews, who have this sense, now hang on a second, you're just going to let these, just to pick a neighboring nation, these Syrians, or maybe these Jordanians, these people nearby us, you're just going to let them in willy-nilly? We've been trying to follow God for generations. We have more than a millennium now of history of our people humbly trying to serve God and working for this, and you're just going to sweep the whole world in? And yet that is the good news. That God has decided in his mercy to be merciful, to be generous to all people. And so we get in on this thing that is, maybe, I'll put it in scare quotes, this thing that is by rights Israel's. Because Jesus Christ has come to initiate a global reign of peace. Now, this king that Zechariah promised is not a conqueror. For all of human history, right down to the present day, if you want global influence, you're going to need a military, an army and a navy, and more recently an air force, but you're going to need soldiers and sailors and lots of weapons to impose your will on others. And yet this king that Zechariah says will have a global reign will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem. And the battle bow shall be cut off, and he shall command peace to the nations. You see, this king and his kingdom are different from all the kings and kingdoms that have come before. This king comes to Jerusalem on a donkey, not on a horse. See, we talk about Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. There's a lot of history behind Jesus' triumphal entry. Typically, what you do when you win a battle, actually, it's a fairly widespread practice in the ancient world, is after the battle is over, you make a big show of coming in to the city. And typically, maybe the centerpiece of this whole thing is the commander or the king riding in on a tall horse in his armor and all his glory, to show that he has just conquered. And yet, Jesus, or let me say for now, Zechariah's promised king, comes in on a donkey, which is a nice way to get around in the ancient world, but it's not the animal that you use for war. This king comes in on a donkey, not on a war horse. And of course, having the benefit of hindsight, being where we are at the end of this story, we remember that Jesus Christ did not bring his kingdom with a sword, but with a cross. We sang the hymn this morning, "Onward, Christian soldiers, marching as to war, not with a banner going before, not with a flag, still less with infantry or cavalry going before, but with the cross of Jesus." You see, the cross represents a whole new way to be in the world. Not killing one's enemies, nor simply passively submitting to one's enemies, but serving one's enemies. This is what Jesus does on the cross. And Jesus' reign, the reign of the crucified one, will mean the end of war. And what this means is that war and violence, however much it may be the case that we can't see a way around them in certain situations, war and violence are backward. One theologian called war anti-historical. War represents a reversal, a going in the wrong direction, because we can see by God's promises here in Zechariah and other places, we can see into the future when war will be finished and done. And so we have a chance to live now toward that present reality because we know, that future reality, because we know that this king is making real peace. Now, a question that may be sitting heavy on someone's mind right now, and one that I wrestled with as I was reading this text, is this. Is it possible that a world of peace and plenty can really exist? Could there be a world without soldiers, without armies, without killing? It sounds great, of course. Like, we would all love to live in a world where no one does violence. But is this possible? I mean, think about the Israelites hearing this. Yeah, Zechariah, that sounds great, but let's look at just the last 100 years here. We got overthrown by an empire, and the only reason we got to leave that empire was because another bigger, badder empire came along and went to war against them. And now they've come back to Jerusalem, but they still don't have an heir of David on the throne. So if you think back to those promises that God made to David about one of the sons of your body I'll put on your throne, and your house is going to continue forever before me, like, that stuff just sounds absurd now. Now that we're back in Jerusalem, now that we're back in the ruins of Jerusalem with the temple destroyed and no king on the throne, what do you mean by saying that our king is going to come to us and rule the world? Of course, it didn't just seem absurd to them. What about our world? We live in the world of predator drones, nuclear weapons, and chemical weapons. So do we dare to hope for a peaceful world? Amen. Can this be possible? In answer to that question, I want to point you to a phrase in verse 12. Zechariah says, "Return to your stronghold, O prisoners of hope." You see, Christian hope is one of the things that distinguishes the Christian. See, Christians have hope against the odds. Our hope is grounded in God's promises. As the next half of verse 12 says, God says, "Today I declare." So God says, I understand, O my people, that you look around and you see destruction. I understand that you look around and you see hunger. I understand that you look around and you see weakness. But today I declare that I will restore. And see, this gives us a better way than what the world can offer. The world, by and large, offers people two options. If you'll let me throw some big ideas into some little baskets here, the world, by and large, offers two options. Some people are very optimistic about progress. We can look around at the world and say, look how much better the world is than it was 100, 1,000, 2,000 years ago. And we can say, this is the train that the world's on. The world is going to keep getting better and better and better until the end. This is pretty typical among people in the United States that we call liberal, in sort of a very wide-ranging sense of the word. On the other hand, the world can offer us a pessimism. The world can offer us a good look around at the world to say, look, things are spiraling downward. Things are getting worse and worse and worse. And you'll save yourself a lot of sweat if you resign to the fact that things are going downhill. This seems to be a little bit more common among those people that we sort of widely call conservative. And yet hope, Christian hope, is different from either of these. You see, when you call someone a prisoner of hope, that's an interesting phrase because everyone wants to have hope, but no one wants to be a prisoner. You see, the reason that Zechariah can call the Israelites prisoners of hope is that despair is simply not an option for the Israelites. God has made certain promises, and it is woven into Israel's story that God does the impossible. Israel began with Abraham, a man whose name means exalted ancestor and who is too old to have children. Israel begins right from the beginning of the prologue to their story with God doing impossible things. And so it is likewise for us. As long as we believe that God raised Jesus Christ from the dead, despair is not an option. And so we don't look around at the world and say, look how much better things are, and look how much better things keep getting. We don't look around at the world and say, look how things are on the decline. See, the Christian can look around at the world and acknowledge maybe things are getting better right now, maybe things are getting worse right now, maybe things are going to be on the upswing or on the downswing for centuries at a time. That's not where our hope is grounded. You see, Christians don't found our hope on predictions, on trends and observations, but on the promises of God. And in this way, we are prisoners of hope. So even when we look around and we would like to despair, even when we look around and ask ourselves, can a world of peace and plenty ever really exist? Can it be that there will be the kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven? Amen. We cannot answer that no, because we have seen God do the impossible once before already. Mm-hmm. And so this changes the way we live each day. We know where all this is going. We've been given a glance at the end, and we are gifted to live in the present like that's where the world is going, even when it seems like the world is not going that way. So let us always remember this, that whatever is going on at the present moment, we can cling to the hope that God has made a promise, and God will deliver on that promise. Amen. And one day, the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Amen.